Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Lorgar's discovery, Lorgar's Betrayal in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Index Asteroots, Final Shore. Origins. When the pod marked 12 was thrown away from the Emperor's domain on Terra, the tides of the warp threw it more distantly than most. It came to rest on the world of Nuceria, which the Imperium would dub a civilized world, known for a highly stratified population and massively popular gladiator games. The pod's flight was noticed as a speck in the third eye of nearly every psyker in the galaxy, though most simply dismissed it. The last remnants of the children of Isha knew better. The craft world Yandin sent forces to kill the young Primarch, for they knew what the omens meant, that the child contained in the pod was likely to cause grievous harm to the Eldar. Perhaps that party would have indeed the young Primarch, had Eldrad Ulthran of Ulthwi, who had also seen into the skeins of the warp relating to Nuceria, not intervened. He told the party that attacking the 12th Primarch, whether successfully or not, would only worsen the Eldar's fate. Instead, he encouraged them to speak with him and take him with them. Eldrad may be the greatest seer to ever have lived, and even in those days, his reputation was significant. As such, the Yandin group descended in peace, not war. Why? Because they have believed my lies, Kyrene. And I thank Siguruk for that. I had feared the consequences of this request, feared them so deeply that I had almost turned back from his flight, despite knowing what attacking the Monkey Lordling could unleash. Not coming would have invited disaster, I knew that. But I had not seen it. I do not know the full details of the present human scheme, though I can see well its potentially apocalyptic consequences. Yet of what I am aware of thus far, I know that the attack would have merely invited further retribution from humanity. But Angren's psychic abilities, and the warp-tainted technology of Nuceria, obscures vision's details, and Zanal would not have believed logic alone. So I said I had seen fragments from beyond that veil. And the only thing that can redeem that lie is this med scheme's success. Eldrad Ulthran. The young Primarch took the name Angandrir, though to human ears the precise pronunciation would be corrupted to Angren. He was genetically programmed with a distaste for all species but the human, yet it was not a strong compulsion, and one Angandrir soon threw off through his soul, which was not caged by the same. He came to see the Eldar who had rescued him as his family, regardless of details of species. Angandrir was known, of course, to not be Eldar, yet he was not truly human, even transhuman, either. His soul was too bright, his psychic powers too innate, and indeed his passions too strong. Angandrir learned to control those passions and powers as all Eldar of the craft worlds did, for though his soul may not have been tied to the great enemy, none knew whether he was susceptible to chaos corruption. No, he was not precisely Eldar, yet he was raised as such, and came to see himself in great part as such. Angandrir knew, too, that he had been created for war, and while he tried to avoid fully embracing that fate, he knew well that his adopted people could not escape the wars that raged throughout the galaxy, not forever. For a brief time Angandrir walked the path of the seer, learning to channel his gifts into understanding of destinies, yet within a decade he foresaw that he would need to leave that path. Thus Angandrir looked at the elaborate beauty of Yandin and the wondrous horrors outside and stepped, for the first time but not the last, onto the path of the warrior. Yet what Angandrir and his seer mentor, Thenad Ryanzanal, had learned went further than that. The Imperium of Man, led by the Primarch's biological father, was rising, and if it came to the full measure of its potential domination the Eldar would in all likelihood end, if not the craft worlds, then at least the Exodusites, Harlequins, and Comorites. And so Angandrir returned to Nuceria, alone, to rejoin the species he had been created to lead, to fight alongside the Imperium, and in time forge either an alliance, or a dagger in its back. The Great Crusade. Angren spent his early time on Nuceria leading a gladiatorial revolt to weaken the planet's government. The gladiators, wrecks with shattered minds though they were, presented a potent military force to topple a government Angren very quickly grew to hate. With Angren's strategic mind, they were a hammer assisted by the scalpel of certain bandits co-opted by the Primarch. The Primarch, dubbed the Red Outlander by the Nucerians for his presumed long wanderings in his early life, soon ascended to the position of Praetor of Deshier, ending the gladiatorial games and generally decrementing governmental brutalities, even if that required forbidding the former gladiators from reaching governmental positions. The butcher's nails could not easily be removed, and their effects interfered with the warp in ways that raised Angren's suspicions. The gladiators would die in the same way as their masters, marginalized, and cursing the Outlander's betrayal. Yet the common population's lot trended upwards. And then, as foreseen, the Emperor of Mankind arrived. Angren had learned how to hide his origins from his father, who revealed no reason for suspicion. The Emperor gave him command of his 12th Legion. They were not as the Red Outlander had expected. The Warhounds were brutal and destructive warriors, supported by tight bonds of brotherhood. They were every bit the Eldar's stereotypes of humanity. Angren was disgusted by their ruinous tactics, their unrestrained militancy, and even their baseless loyalty. After talking to Legion Master Greer and two of his most trusted subordinates in disappointment, however, Angren met Karn of the 8th Company, and found in Astard who, though a brutal warrior, had not closed his mind to all else. The Warhounds, Angren renamed the Final Shore, a term that was translated into High Gothic phonetically, leading to the Legion being dubbed the World Eaters. Angren let that name remain as a symbol of what they would have to be, and what they would need to compensate for. They would, he insisted, remain at a distance from the greater Imperium, keeping their distance from the Crusade and from humanity. Yet they would no longer smash onto worlds, human or no, in the manner of an atomic explosion. Indeed, human worlds conquered by the World Eaters, from the greenhouses of Thotiatha to the metallic asteroids of the Olefine Cluster, remained much as they were, at least physically. Yet Angren felt no mercy for their culture, especially in the cases where he suspected the taint of the Great Serpent. He did not enforce the imperial truth in all cases, but required changes. The World Eaters intentionally avoided conquering Eldar worlds for the obvious reasons. Indeed, Angren's contacts with his species during the Crusade were limited, often explained to his legion as simply vanishing for a duration. When opposing orcs and similar non-negotiable species, the World Eaters retained a tendency for extermination. But against Hrud, Demiurge, and the like, Angren did his best to negotiate and learn. Stuck between two species, he was more open than most to others. Still, when the time came, he chased those races into the depths of space. The World Eaters, perhaps 85,000 strong during this time, were based on Nuceria, but recruited from worlds throughout the galaxy. Angren's supposed home world was built up with silver spires, and managed to evolve into a prosperous and self-sufficient world, inspired by Iyanden, but the Primarch paid it less heed than most other Legion home worlds, for his emotional connection to it was vague. Angren was distant from most of his brothers, but with 4 he forged lasting bonds. Conrad Kerr's deep sense of justice and similarly distant status led to some amount of mutual respect. Horus and Sanguinius had doubts about the Great Crusade that helped crystallize Angren's own thoughts, and all 3 excelled in personal combat despite these doubts. Angren thought that Horus was below optimal self-control and that Sanguinius had a deficit of cynicism, but regardless the 3 became close friends, and fought together on some minimally controversial campaigns against particularly mighty enemies, notably, the Orc state of Goro, which had been known as the Jewel of Olaner's Green Coalition. Yet Angren's closest and most lasting friendship was with Magnus of Prospero. The Crimson King was the only one of the Primarches to be a more powerful psyker than the Red Outlander, and understood, too, his concerns for beauty and preservation. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children was fond of beauty in his own way, but his view of perfection clashed with the World Eaters' somewhat half-hearted approach to the Crusade. Other Primarches, such as Leman Russ or Perturabo, viewed Angren with general, well-founded, suspicion. That suspicion was in large part due to Angren's reforms of his legion. The Red Outlander, or the Bridging Tide, a paradoxical nickname of Eldar origin, desired the 12th to stand at his side, no matter revealed his beginnings and plans to those within the legion he felt he could trust most, Karn among them. The legion's bonds were for a time uncertain in those years, as a legion that had for so long been desperate to find its Primarch was mainly confused by their gene father. But those same bonds kept trust intact, and so the legion retained cohesion, and tallies of military victories kept mounting, and for most that was enough. The World Eaters were offered the chance to dive into the unknown, and because they knew no fear, they did so. Beyond that, the Red Outlander moved to modify the 12th's gene seed, not only within new asteroids but within existing ones. He wished at first to control its mental effects, especially any induced hatred of Xenos. But the modifications, borrowing mainly from the Eldar genomes, quickly grew more profound and complex. Erlin was not sure of the full intent of the alterations, not yet. The Primarch of the 12th had not been what he had expected. Erlin would have predicted a worse Gruner, but Angren was honorable. Or perhaps something other than honorable. Erlin could have seen Angren as a Primarch of the 19th, more than the 12th. He had his deceits, but his changes to the Legion had struck at its roots. Traditions had been twisted, doctrines had been subtly shaded. And yet in all of it, Erlin found triumph. Because they were winning. Because whatever they were becoming, the 12th would no longer be butchers, and the butchers among them were too battle-obsessed to realize it. Erlin felt the springing sensation at the back of his neck and rubbed it again. Casualty rates from the implantations were low, but non-zero. His own body, though, had reacted well. His mind, too. They were mental changes, he suddenly realized, weren't they? At least in part, there was a subtle grace that was physical, but so much of his transformation was in the way he thought. It was clearer now, with less mental noise. His battle rage had been diminished, in favor of a profound focus. For a moment, Erlin considered the possibility that his unaltered mind would have been revolted at those changes, beneficent though they were. Then he chuckled to himself, and wondered how he could ever call a space marine unaltered. No, he had no idea where Angren was leading them. But then, in the beginning, he hadn't known where the Emperor was leading them, either. He wasn't even sure he knew now. All of the 12th Legion were altered, from librarians to tech marines, except for the dreadnoughts, led by Lhork I. Angren nonetheless turned the 12th's first Legion master to his side, not in the least by seconding them to Iyanden, where Wraithbone was sung into their chassis, stopping the most painful effects of their internment. But although the gene seed modifications were mostly successful, and Angren had ensured most of the World Eaters would join him in leaving if necessary, the rest of his work was less successful. The Imperium of Man was only growing more and more powerful, and if no great change occurred it would indeed come to dominate the galaxy, with the World Eaters completely incapable of stopping them. And from Angren's interactions with the Emperor, limited though they were, and his chief subordinates such as Malkador, the Bridging Tide knew that a diplomatic solution, no matter how much Eldrad Ulthran might have dreamed of it, was implausible. The Great Betrayal. Lorgar's rebellion came as a surprise, both welcome and the opposite. The great enemy was nothing to be trifled with, and using beings allied to chaos as pawns was always risky at best. Yet the rebellion presented, too, a way to check the advance of the Imperium. So Angren allied with Lorgar, though he was never interested in any deeper allegiance and fully planned to betray the traitors when the damage had been done. Yet the revolt was less organized than Angren had at first thought. 8 legions gathered at Istvan, dispatching loyalists within them to the surface of the system's third world. The intent was to bombard the surface, yet the ships of the Iron Hands and Iron Warriors instead began to bombard each other. Angren, seeing an opportunity, fired on the White Scars, though some have recounted his attack came before the Iron Legion's clash, and stemmed not from logic but from repulsion at those cultists of the great enemy. Angren had announced the essence of the truth to his entire legion, as well as its human auxiliaries, in transit to Istvan, speaking of the need to check the destruction the Great Crusade was wreaking, and the Eldar alliance, but also of the necessity of preventing a full traitor victory. Some, of course, refused to follow the Red Outlander, and those of his sons, led by Macer Varen, staged an insurrection. The 12th Legion, now the final shore in full, though humans persisted in calling them World Eaters, hardened their souls, in those days, to the act of kinslaying when it was required, and yet embraced those portions of brotherhood that remained with a brilliant torch, shining only brighter in the inevitability of darkness. The final shore's war against the White Scars was one fought on even terms, yet while the 12th inflicted moderate casualties on their foes, the 5th was faced with a foe that evaded any confrontation that was not a guaranteed victory. Angandrir had no desire to destroy the White Scars, at least not yet. Rogaldorn stepped in to negotiate peace, and Angandrir feigned a misunderstanding, an explanation Jagatai was only too eager to accept. Angandrir had wished for the Istvan war to be a relatively bloodless one. That was not so. Varen's men reaped an outsized toll, and many of them would escape, though all died in Malkador's ritual on Titan, a sacrifice whose psychic effects helped shield the survivors from Chaos Taint, although it was not Angandrir who planned that. The White Scars did less damage, but altogether the organization was so poor that even allied ships of the Iron Warriors and Word-Bearers shot at the final shore. Ondondrir understood, in Istvan's cauldron, why the great enemy was so often called simply Chaos. He would have reason, for a long time, to regret underestimating it so. The traders split into two fleets and voyaged towards Earth. The World Eaters were assigned to the Second Fleet, together with the Word-Bearers, Iron Hands, and Dark Angels. This Second Fleet was stalled by a turbulent warp and by various Primarchs' desires to burn Imperial worlds, as well as sabotage by those few loyalists who survived the purges. Angandrir chose to step back from those debates, but they deepened his impression that the rebellion would lose, badly, with or without him. For this reason, he attempted to strategically weaken the Imperium with strikes on locations he had foreseen to have likely importance in the future. Locations, and individuals. For yet another reason for the Second Fleet's sluggishness was a series of harrying attacks launched by the Luna Wolves. Outside of a few individuals with strong inter-legion friendships, the final shore cared little enough which other legion they fought, but Angandrir was not so sanguine. Yet he pressed on, wishing to ensure a balance between Imperial and Chaos forces. Despite being delayed again and again, the Second Fleet reached Terra, and Angandrir descended onto the planet with them. Yet by now both the Primarch and many in the Legion were filled with regret, for upon seeing humanity's home world it became evident that the revolt had been much more ruinous than previously thought. Ruinous, and threatening. The Bridging Tide had only obtained limited Eldar counsel before his decision to fight by Lorgar's side, but there was agreement that 8 Space Marine legions, with limited support from cults but only a tiny fraction of the Imperial army, could not hope to overthrow the Imperium even if allied to the great enemy. But Lorgar, despite being considered one of the martially weakest Primarches, despite the influence of Chaos on his mind, despite the best efforts of the Loyalists, had seen the single open way and taken it. They could not have won a war, but Lorgar had substituted a war with a battle. The 20 came to Angandrir on the morning of the 72nd day of the 12th's involvement in the siege, which had focused on killing Loyalist heroes more than on breaching the Imperial Palace's walls. They were various luminaries in the Legion, quite likely the 20 most important individuals within it except for the Primarch himself. Karn was there, and Lorgar, and First Captain Erlin, and Chief Librarian Vorias, and Chief Apothecary Fabricus, and they all came with one request to Angandrir, and that was to leave the war. You speak to me of the poisoned consequences of this path that I chose at Crusade's end. Of an Imperium that cannot be allowed to fall, but that will not forgive us for millennia. Of worlds consecrated to chaos, and of heroes that deserved a better fate than our blades. You speak of my mistakes, of a mission of peace that brought only suffering. You speak of everything I have ever done as being undone by this war. You speak, in sum, of me as a fool. And worst of all, you speak truly. Angandrir, the Bridging Tide. The final shore, over the next 2 days, ensured that the positions of the Dark Angels, Iron Hands, and Word-Bearers were maximally reliant on them, and on the morning of the 75th day the teleporters lit, and the warriors and ships of the 12th Legion were in the Epsilon Eridani system, as Angandrir had planned for at siege's end. The Chaos Legion's front collapsed, and the beleaguered defenders surged forward, if only briefly. Angandrir remained near Sol for long enough to feel the shockwave of Lorgar's death and the Emperor's crippling. His earlier estimate had been entirely correct, the forces of Chaos were driven off Terra in disarray. The Imperium had been greatly weakened, and Chaos had gained great ground, but there was abundant room left open to the Eldar. But that did little to justify the betrayal, or the cliff's edge dance. The escape. Angandrir led the final shore in flight to Nuceria, mind still clouded by the darkness of the war. Having left the vicinity of Terra before any other legion, they were able to reach their home world through the webway without loss. The Primarch stayed silent in the days of the flight. The leaders of craft worlds around the galaxy sent psychic calls, some despondent, many triumphant. The grip of the Imperium had been broken, and the Eldar were among those the species that could bloom in the gaps. Yet Angandrir made no response, with Karn in effective command of the Legion. Instead he looked into pasts and futures, seeking paths that led the Legion and the Eldar to some form of victory. When the fleet of the 12th Legion returned to Nuceria, they found it embroiled in civil war between Chaos cultists acting in supposed support of the Legion and Imperial loyalists. Angandrir had foreseen this, yet the rest of the Legion was shocked by this final revelation of their betrayal's consequences. The ships of the 12th Fleet, led by the Adamant Resolve's human, or, rather, transhuman, for by now all of the Final Shore's crew had been altered in some way, Shipmaster Lodarisarin, bombarded the heretics, to the great shock of everyone planet-side. When Angandrir walked into the Spire of Fate, still unspeaking, attended by an honor guard of Final Shore, the Imperial defenders thought, for a brief time, that the rumors were false, that the Legion that had never quite been theirs had remained true to the Imperium. This was supported by Erlin's and others' contribution in putting down the Chaos insurrection. The Red Outlander merely walked to the summit of the tower and sat in meditation, and there he remained, calmly singing to the tower that surrounded him, for a Terran week. He arose as the fleet of the Emperor's children, composing much of the Third Legion yet still outnumbered by the Final Shore, arrived in system, led by a vengeful Julius Caesauron. Both sides had already fired their first shots when Angandrir declared his command, retreat. And to his disbelieving legion, as well as to the librarians of the Emperor's children, he proclaimed that those who would truly fight in these skies would find only doom. And with a note of destiny's end, the Spire of Fate shattered around him. The Final Shore disengaged, carrying with its fleet the few Nusarians who were loyal to Angandrir whatever his path was. Yet Karn of the Eighth refused to follow their retreat. Instead he covered it, together with the fraction of the legion that supported him. They did so without prompting, playing their role even though that role was not strictly a necessary one, knowing what they were damning themselves to even if they could not express it, paying with their disobedience for others' freedom. Karn's following victory, achieved while severely outnumbered and outgunned, was a masterpiece of fleet warfare, though there can be no doubt it was in part due to Angandrir's foresight. The Emperor's children held the world, but suffered significantly more casualties, and Karn even boarded the Pride of the Emperor, killing Caesauron before being forced off the ship. The Silverbound, as those who stood with Karn dubbed themselves, remained subordinate to their Primarch and the goals of the Greater Final Shore, yet never since Terra have they fought side by side with those brothers. On the Adamant Resolve, as it sped away from Nusaria, Angandrir spoke to the legion of the myriad paths he had seen atop Nusaria's tallest building, not one of them acceptable. So he had rolled the dice, paying with luck for time. Henceforth, the Final Shore would fight alongside the Eldar. Yet their war would not be forged of mere tribal loyalty, not to their tribe and not to another's. Their loyalty was to the Primarch alone, and above even that, to beauty and wisdom and organic eternity. And when the time came then, fateless or no, the Final Shore would play their bright and distant part in Ranadandra. The Long War. If one divides the realms of the Milky Way into a dozen broad factions, there can be no doubt the Final Shore stands with the Eldar of the craft worlds. They are nomadic, though the Adamant Resolve is in some ways a craft world of its own now, one complete with an Inception Shrine, for the Final Shore is for all intents and purposes an aspect shrine. While their integration into Eldar society has never been more than partial, they are generally treated as treading the path of the warrior, not as aliens. The presence of the Asteroutes, as well as the transhuman crew of their vessels, has taken its place as a social clade within Eldar society, changing it as much as it has been changed itself. The children of Isha have become less isolated, from other species and among themselves, than they were in the centuries after the fall, forging a strange empire without a center, one of worldships and starways, with planets being shrines and preserves more than bases. Their detractors would note, however, that they have not become any less haughty. The Final Shore have, indeed, in many cases fought for Eldar interests. On the Mortarial world of Scalathrax, Karn's Silverbound turned away a massive Slaaneshi invasion headed for Ulthwi itself before the Imperium knew of it. On Altansar, deep within the Eye itself, warriors under Lhork freed the once lost craft world from the chains of the storm in a running battle with the Doom Fists, though much of its population, corrupted by chaos, had to be left behind. In the Grand Al-Ghul system, a titanic invasion the Ultramarines were preparing for the invasion of the Haldala sector of Exodite worlds was thwarted during its preparatory stages, in a series of brief engagements that damaged the system's, unusually inhumane, Mechanicum facilities for centuries to come. They have had their share of failures as well, such as Angandrir successfully defending the craft world of Malantai from a massive Tyranid assault only to see its entire population wiped out by a single psychic beast, or a number of their attempts to end the Necron threat before it grew out of control. There are certainly occasions on which the Final Shore has acted independently of Eldar Command, or even Council. Recently, for instance, a conclave of several leading Litarchas cooperated with, unusually, Orokin of the Necrons to divert the Wa'ak of Gazgul Thrika towards Armageddon, to slow it down and to warn the Imperium of what it could yet become. The Final Shore's Primarch fought on the front lines for 10 millennia. Given his psychic might and physical strength, he became perhaps the most powerful of all his brothers in personal combat, doubly so with Sanguinius fighting only rarely, and Horus departing. Yet he also fought in the most dangerous bridgeheads, and often alone. Angandrir had cast his fate aside, and with it he had cast aside so many other certainties. The dusk came with the Tyranid hive fleets, descending onto the galaxy like a storm wall. The tendril of hive fleet Kraken headed towards Iyanden was easily vast enough to destroy it, and Angandrir only barely heard of the impending assault on his first home in time. He took command of Malantai, now a silent place he considered his personal failure, and met the fleet alone. There were no known witnesses to that clash, for even Eldrad did not dare to gaze so deep into the maw of the hive mind, yet Kraken was damaged grievously, and the intervention of Uriel's corsairs was enough to save the craft world without severe losses. Magnus saw his brother with the golden eye of his astral form, saw him as he was and would ever be, an intricate lord, one whose gaze was forever scarred by a necessary betrayal, a giant in blue and white plate that had once been ceramite, holding something his mind rebelled at calling a halberd. "So I am not alone after all," Angandrir softly said, as he prepared to face the swarm. "Of course you would be the one to come. The risk was not worth it, brother." Magnus left that false humility without comment, instead laying his unreal hand on his brother's shoulder and looking at the wall of flesh, drawing ever closer. 1,000,000,000,000 was understating it, and he was not even really here. "Why, Angandrir?" he asked, and both knew without telepathy what he meant. The bridging tide looked at the Tyranids, and sang a note of destiny's return. It was not an answer, yet it was enough for Magnus to see the truth. For so long he had, in a sense, seen Angandrir as a willing slave to the Eldar, being forced to choose between two species and choosing wrongly. He had pitied his brother, though not so much as he feared and respected him. But Angandrir's melody would not have been half so beautiful had he picked the other path, and there had never been a third. The Eldar had not used him. They had created him, yet when he had stood with them it had been of his own choice. "The breach will lead your image to safety," Angandrir said, turning to Magnus in the moments before impact. "And I couldn't save everything, but perhaps I have saved enough that better flowers will bloom. My path ends here, Magnus. But my song does not." And then the wave was on them, and they were but two flames fighting the endless dark. The damage to the morale of the Final Shore was significant, but that to organization was far more limited. Angandrir had been a distant leader, in the end, above all a symbol and an object of loyalty which his death has only enshrined. Organization. After the end of the Great Betrayal, the Final Shore gradually moved away from Legion structure into their present, looser aspect Shrine-esque organization. The process took decades to complete, but their last Legion-wide engagement was the battle over Nuceria. But the Final Shore is as far from a typical aspect Shrine as it is from a typical Legion, due to not being composed of Eldar. There is no overall command in the Final Shore. War hosts travel largely independently from one another between craft worlds and sites of battle. Each of these is led by a transhuman, usually a Start, Litarch, considered equal in rank to an Eldar Autarch. Below the Litarches, and their immediate Fluctarch subordinates in sufficiently large fleets, are sergeants, leading squads of Astaroths, nominally numbering 13 each, as well as the captains, which are not Astaroths but rather the shipmasters and commanders of the non-Astarte sections of the Final Shore, often Psykers. The most powerful Litarches are typically those that have survived since the days of the Betrayal, such as the Maverick Delvaris and the powerful Seer Eska, but even with healing knowledge far surpassing the Imperium's, few Astaroths remain from that time, especially among those not encased in Wraith Dreadnoughts, and so most Litarches are later recruits. I initiate Pentapedros, I do still live. If you call this life, how much of me is flesh, how much metal, and how much wraith bone, even I could not tell you. That is why I no longer lead. But my mind is still fast enough, when it can be bothered to waken fully, and as to my chassis, well, there is a reason why I'm still here after all those battles. Advice? There are litarches who have asked me for advice, and whom I have refused. Though frankly I only refused to talk to Rokrax because I don't want to talk to him ever again. I like you better, that much is certain. But my advice is this, don't listen to me, or those like me who have seen millennia. Our concerns are oft removed from yours, or cracked under the pressure of time and wounds and rebirths. We are made grand by legacy, aye, but those few who remember the crusade, or the decades after, we are not defined by the same as you, not truly. You will know battle yet, but not the same internal struggle every one of us we were defined by. Because you are final shore, and that alone. We will always also be world eaters. Lorgar I. The final shore is mainly composed of these war hosts, but also includes aspect shrines maintained by final shore members on various craft worlds and worlds, usually including both Astaroths under a sergeant and crew under a captain. It should be emphasized that both the Astarte force and the human adjuncts are, today, considered to be final shore. Both the Astaroths of the final shore, likely numbering near 200,000, though their precise population is impossible to calculate, and their transhuman crew, whose main military role is naval, but who form a full society in their own right, would independently significantly bolster the strength of the Eldar, but together they form as intrinsic a part of their military as Corsairs and Eldar aspect warriors. While war hosts are nomadic, they tend to remain around a single craft world for years on end if not on a major intervention. Other non-human species are not, technically, final shore, and neither are unmodified humans that are propelled to deal with the Eldar from curiosity or self-interest, but both often travel with their hosts. The fraction of psychers among the final shore has risen over the years. They are typically trained by experienced Eldar seers, or else by sufficiently respected final shore psychers, though the chain of mentorship rarely extends far from either Eldar or Astarte teachers. The Astaroths among them do not make up a formal Liberius, but fulfill many of the same functions as librarians and tech marines in other legions, and are also under Fluctarch or Litarch command rather than attached to a single squad. The Apothecarian has remained intact, although one is maintained separately by each host and includes non-Astarte members. There is one war host, however, the largest of them all, that stands apart from the rest. The Silverbound maintain a more rigid organization but one broadly similar to the rest of the final shore. Yet they are forever outcast for their ancestors' actions at Nuceria, simultaneously and paradoxically honored for their sacrifice and despised for their disobedience. Karn still leads them, but it is known that, while fate has protected him up to this point, it will in time take back all that it had granted. Combat Doctrine. The final shore fight is a combined force between the Astaroths and their crew. They are guided by the foresight of seers, both Eldar and their own, to the battlefields where they are most needed to disrupt future anti-Eldar activity and in the service of individual Litarch's inscrutable goals, as well as in defense of craft worlds. But while psychic guidance and powers have their role in final shore actions, it is a foolish enemy who forgets that they are Astaroths, who despite their bizarre gene seed are no less fearsome in close combat than those loyal to the Emperor of Mankind or the Gods of Chaos. Indeed, with transhuman allies and an abundance of armament, the final shore has a relatively greater emphasis on close combat than most other legions. In attacking a world, the final shore apply every effort to make a precision strike, often a secret one. With their gene seed typically increasing dexterity and strength at some cost in endurance, though only when compared with other space marines, the final shore Astaroths tend to be especially good at such missions of targeted destruction. When they do invade a location to capture it, it is more often a ship than a planet, and here the cunning of the naval crew often plays as big a role as the final shore's boarding assault. Defense of both planets and craft worlds, and sometimes their own fleets, is a role the final shore have to play far too often. They put somewhat of an emphasis on naval battle, and on land and in the void alike, often act as an anvil to an Eldar hammer, or, perhaps, an Eldar scalpel. The final shore will form a defensive wall, and the Eldar will launch specific counter-attacks. Such a tactic is typically temporary. If the situation deteriorates, Often the Eldar will form the main defensive force, while the final shore launch a small number of massive counter-attacks. Homeworld. Angandrir landed on the world of Nuceria, but he was raised on Iyanden. His legion, when it was still such, was recruited from a great variety of planets the World Eaters conquered or were otherwise associated with during the Great Crusade. Since the Bridging Tide's death, his resting place of Malantai has been a forbidden shrine of sorts, but the true bases of the final shore are aspect shrines on craft worlds, and fleets throughout the galaxy. Yet Nuceria retains a certain place in the final shore's memory, and Iyanden serves as a certain focal point in its present. Nuceria's spires were more farms, and psychic beacons, than miniature hives. The planet was never densely populated during the Crusade. It was a beautiful world, but the final shore abandoned it without hesitation when Ka-Asuran came. The Imperium purged the chaos taint of the planet and deported its population to various other Imperial worlds. Then, they scoured the surface, albeit somewhat half-heartedly. In truth, they knew there was nothing important left on Nuceria. One of its spires, the Spire of Dawn, does still stand, uninhabited for 10 millennia but still gleaming as on the day it was built. Iyanden, the light in the darkness, resplendent in yellow and bright blue, is the most populous of the Eldar craft worlds, and its military strength is further bolstered by the most elaborate infinity circuit of them all, allowing for the deployment of their dead more often and in larger numbers than elsewhere, a highly controversial detail among other craft worlds. It is a place of art, boldness, and interaction with non-Eldar species, yet also a world that never allows itself to forget, in all its pride, the darkness of the galaxy outside, and thus remains a world haunted by war. While the final shore has no loyalty to a single craft world, it was Iyanden's dreams that Angandrir based their ideology in, and the culture of the final shore, while knitted together from countless sources, is based around the conjoined styles of Nuceria and Iyanden. Beliefs. The final shore hold the fundamental value of Mindy, an untranslatable world combining beauty, complexity, fate, and proper discipline in psychic powers. They see the craft world in Exodite Eldar, and the web-like domain they are preeminent in, as the most deserving of their loyalty for those reasons, and have internalized many other Eldar beliefs, including the final battle of the Ranadandra. But they are fond of paradoxes and apparent contradictions, and so they, except for the Silverbound, thoroughly reject fate proper, and retain a blazing will to fight against it. Trying to understand the intricacies of final shore beliefs will drive many even madder than trying to understand those of the Eldar, for they combine the idiosyncrasies of two species in minds with aspects of both. Yet for all that, the final shore's ultimate goal seems to be the same as that of Iyanden, the protection and restoration of the so-called New Eldar Empire, as the Imperials term it, Imperium Eldari Secundus, and the containment, or even destruction, of the powers of chaos. Gene Seed. The gene seed of the final shore is wildly divergent from the baseline, more so than even that of the great enemy's servants, although those who bear it are still recognizably Astaroths. Aside from the hordes of altered organs, including Pontadiers, it greatly enhances the psychic abilities of those initiates who have them, confers greater strength and far greater agility but somewhat less of an increase in resilience and stamina, and alters cognition to be more capable of understanding and experiencing things outside normal human experience. The non-Astarte members of the final shore are modified in lesser ways, but their inhumanity was certainly crucial to preserving their relations with the Eldar in the first centuries following the betrayal. Battle Cry. The final shore rarely use a true battle cry, but when they do, it is the phrase, meaningless in the Eldar language, as well as in any other language, human, or Zeno, Emela Iyandaniatamialei Angandrir, which is taken to be both a celebration and a memorial of the Primarch. 999.m41. The curving spires and hyperbolic arches glistened with a waxy sheen, and adamantine roads swirled around them. Karn of the Silverbound, clad in a simple robe of mourning, paid them little attention as he passed below them, trying to block them out as much as possible, for every millimeter of the structures sang of loss, shattering, and ruin. This was Malantai. This was the empty tomb of a million Eldar, and of his Primarch. He felt fate guiding him. It was deafening now, like the heartbeat of the universe. This was where his path had led all along, a resolution to his struggle. The Silverbound awaited him in orbit, for Malantai was forbidden, and of them all only Karn was willing to go against that dictate, even now. That, too, was fate. He found Angrendur at a crossroads. His Primarch's corpse had either been devoured by the Tyranids or, more likely, collapsed out of existence once that became necessary. Yet his armor still lay there, in only a few pieces, bearing claw marks and a thin covering of dust from decades of abandonment, but otherwise still functional. Supernaturally so. In fact, there was no one around, no one else on this entire world, and so Karn felt no embarrassment at what he did next, no matter if it was defiling his Gene Father's memory. He put on the plates one by one, the fit uncomfortable but not impossible as it should have been. The chest plate he put on last, and then he stood alone, surrounded by a song of remembrance. There was more, he knew there was more, even if it was barely his own will moving his muscles now. He walked forward. 174 footsteps, for the 174 Nusarian months, exactly, that had passed since Angandrir's last battle. There, dropped as if by accident, lay the twin axes, broken and chewed but recognizable without error. Karn knelt and picked them up. The only thing he wondered before he took up those axes was whether that doom he had embraced on Nusaria was truly his, or his Primarch's. The only thing he said was, "And thus my chains melt." It would not have happened if Karn had entered Malantai mere moments earlier, the catalysis would not have worked. But as he picked up light and darkness, and raised them, something changed, a note, a sky, a spire. And then Karn was but a memory. The Primarch that stood in his place shed a tear. He had not expected this, nor had he wished for it. But Ranadandra demanded that there be an Angandrir in its storm. Karn's fate, even if it was not the original Angandrir's. Yet not the Legion's. Victory was not yet impossible, for 10,000 years had been bought for the price of Nusaria's luck, and they had not been wasted. Not by Angandrir, and not by the final shore, which could walk further than he ever had. Ranadandra was here. And Angandrir the bridging tide, Phoenix Lord of the final shore, would stand to meet it. Check the description for the links to the author.